Welcome. I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Center. We're affiliated with Small Church Connections here in Canada, and this is us, Canadian Small Churches in Action podcast. And today we have another very special speaker, someone to interview and talk with about churches, Canadian churches, and their impact on communities. Now, I could tell you all sorts of stuff, but I'm going to let Mike introduce himself. And so can you just answer quick questions here? We'll start off with a quick question. Who are you? And yeah, and ministry journey, anything that helps us understand a little bit of who you are and that type of thing.
Sure. My name's Mike Wood Daly. I grew up in the Don Mills area of Toronto, and went to high school there in Toronto, attended U of T, did a Bachelor of Science, and then ended up going to seminary at McMaster, to Divinity College in Hamilton, and went on to pastoral ministry in suburban Toronto. And sort of that was my introduction to ministry. Grew up in the church youth group. My dad was, chair of the deacons and chair of the board of stewards, and my mom was the church secretary. And me and my siblings were in the youth group and traveled with church musicals and that sort of thing. So long history of growing up in and being involved in the church.
That sounds very interesting. But McMaster, Hamilton, so you've been in this whole I would call it area around Toronto, Hamilton. Hamilton, of course, would never admit that Toronto was taking them over. So we'll leave that there. But you started doing research on the church, outside the church walls, what kind of impact the church was having, and I suppose inside the church walls too. But maybe you can explain a little bit of the Halo project that you've been a part of.
Sure. I think it got started in a few ways. When I was working in pastoral ministry, I loved the various elements that go along with that, and I was involved in pastoral ministry for about 8 years. But one of the things that I found really energizing for myself was the way that congregations can engage with the wider community, and how they can motivate the community to become more empowered themselves. And so I moved from pastoral ministry. I did my doctorates in the area of community development. So I did a doctor of ministry and was working with at-risk and street-involved youth, doing job and skill training, and directed a project for that in Toronto for about 15 years, and moved on to teaching contextual theology and research methodology in the Doctor of Ministry program at Toronto School of Theology. So as I was moving from pastoral ministry into community engagement to teaching people who were coming from ministry vocations and wanting to increase their learning around that, a lot of my interest was focusing on research and how that could help congregations better understand the communities around them. So I was invited to teach a lab for planning students at Ryerson. And the goal of the course was to help planning students who had very little experience within faith communities. So a lot of students who had no faith background or very little faith background, who to help them understand the impact that congregations were having in their surrounding communities, apart from the traditional spiritual, communal, and emotional value that we often use to describe the role of the church and community. Yeah. And there wasn't really any studies that had been done domestically that could help describe that to a person who's never experienced being part of a faith community before. So I came across a study that had been done in Philadelphia. It was a study that was developed by Partners for Sacred Places and University of Pennsylvania's School of Planning and Policy. And they developed a metric to look at how congregations were engaging with their wider communities. So they didn't want to study the impact that they were having so much on members of the congregation. They wanted to look at the impact it was having in the wider community, and the metric that they used was dollars. How is this impacting the social economy? And so we use that study as a part of the course for the students to help them better understand what that looks like, the kind of dollar impact that congregations can be having. And that evolved into a partnered study that we did with Cardis out of Hamilton, which is kind of a social think tank with religious roots, and the City of Toronto Planning Department.
Yeah.
And we studied 10 congregations here in the city. And obviously Canada's it's a whole different ball of wax compared to the States. So
Slightly.
despite the fact that they had, used, what they were using were studies out of the States that were mapping the dollar impact, the social impact of activities that reflect or mirror what congregations do. So an example might be if a congregation has a parish health nurse, what's the value of a public health nurse to community? And so found comparisons within society that would reflect the activities of a congregation. The dollar values were very different between the US and Canada. So we looked for some domestic studies that could help reflect those activities in the Canadian landscape and applied them to those 10 churches in Toronto. And what we discovered was that every dollar that those churches were spending was, at the time, very limited scope of the study, but those churches were contributing about $4.77 for every dollar they spent. And I think if we could all get that kind of return on our investments, we'd be pretty happy.
That's a great return.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, I went to the website and checked out approximately what our town, a town of less than 5,000 people, and the churches in it, and I'm thankful for the great database you guys have put together, that we would be in the millions of dollars contributing to our society, our town itself, without going into the region and dealing with other churches there. It sort of blew me away to think that kind of impact is happening.
Yeah, it's pretty profound, and I think a lot of congregations and they, if they're really busy, they have a lot of activities, they're having people from the community moving through their building, they might have a sense that yes, we're having impact, but I think very few of them tend to appreciate the scope of that dollar impact. If we our more recent research, so beyond those 10 congregations, we've expanded it to do close to 100 across the country, and that dollar value, which we're soon going to be updating that calculator that you spoke of, is closer to around $4.20, somewhere in that neighborhood, rather than the $4.75. So it's come down a little bit with a larger data pool. But when we apply those figures to the expenditures of all of the faith communities across the country, churches, mosques, synagogues are contributing about $15.5 billion to the social economy. And when we think of, that the conversations that we have around the role of church in society and the challenges that church is facing in society today, if we were to lose that impact, Canadian society would be severely diminished as a result.
I was thinking of that as we've been going through COVID, and the question of whether religious societies are essential services came to mind. And I thought, if we didn't have a background such as what the Halo Project has provided, how would we know if we're really an essential service other than saying it? I'm not sure if you've run into that in these last 2 years or so, and some of that.
I think that conversation is definitely out there. The place where I find it coming up most is the conversation around the taxation of churches, or whether churches should be taxed. And one of the things that we've discovered through these studies is that on average, congregations are contributing about 10 times, a little over 10 times, what the benefit to society would be if they were taxed. So, if we look at things like if a congregation had to pay property tax, and if they weren't getting HST credits, and if the government didn't have to pay out the personal tax credits that people benefit from making their contributions to their churches, what churches are contributing is still 10 times that amount that the government would be either saving or taking back in on behalf of the country. And I think that's something that really, when you engage in that conversation and help people to realize that churches aren't just there for the benefit of their own members, that they're having profound impacts on wider society in terms of teaching young people moral and ethical values and services to seniors and providing space for community activities where space may not be otherwise available. Those kinds of activities.
Well, I noticed that and I was trying to put this together in my own head, but certainly the whole facilities that churches can provide and often have provided over the years are very helpful when they're used within a community. You also talk about the common good, and maybe you could flesh out a little bit of that as to how small churches, large churches have a place in the common good for a society.
I think there's several ways. So like some of the things that we measure in our studies are like the value of open space. There are things like parking for the community may not be such an issue in a rural community or a small town, but in larger centers, downtown Toronto, where a church is providing less than market value parking to people in the community during the week. There are churches that are providing community garden lots that might not otherwise be available. Again, in a rural setting, it's not an issue, but if you're looking at downtown Toronto or Calgary or Vancouver and providing that space for community gardens has some significant stuff. There's the spending that churches generate in their community by purchasing supplies and employing people. Churches attract people to communities, and so when somebody drives into a neighborhood or a community to attend church, they'll often stop and buy gas or pick up groceries and those kinds of things. So they're generating spending in the economy. There's the factors that I mentioned earlier around moral and ethical training. There's programs that help individuals deal with substance abuse, sponsoring refugee families and supporting them in ways that are all saving the Canadian government, provincial and municipal governments in terms of the services that they have to provide, those sorts of things. I think the use of space, an example, what we tend to do to evaluate that value is to take what a local school board would charge to rent out a classroom or an auditorium. And we look at the difference between what a church charges to rent out that space. And for example, in Toronto here, church or schools will charge upwards of $300 an hour to rent out a seated auditorium. How many churches are charging $300 an hour to rent out their sanctuary for piano recitals or a community theater production, those sorts of things? So it makes those things possible in ways that aren't otherwise available. I think the single biggest thing that surprises people in churches when we talk about the value or the common good is the value of volunteer work. There's lots of studies that show that people of faith contribute at volunteer time at much higher levels than people in society generally. So there's kind of a faith motivation factor in there that's helping them participate in that way. And Conference Board of Canada says that we can attribute $27 an hour to every volunteer hour that church members contribute or that we facilitate members from the community in terms of their volunteer participation. $27 an hour adds up pretty quickly when you look at the activity that goes on within a church. So all those things add up pretty quickly to how a church, quite apart from how it benefits the members, the way that they come and participate in worship and the care that they receive and the services that they receive. These are all things that are far outside of the church, and the church is having impact in ways of people in the community that the people in the community don't even know, let alone the members of the church often.
So, yeah, and churches may not be aware of that. How do we help churches to understand that kind of community impact that they're having?
I think there's, by looking at projects like these, there are other organizations that are doing some work in this particular area. The National Trust of Canada, which has been looking at, historically, it's looked at preserving architecture of churches that are vulnerable. But in recent years, they've moved to recognizing the social value that these churches have.
Okay.
And so they're starting to tell that story. There's a group called Faith in the Common Good and the Trinity Centers Foundation that are trying to help churches capitalize on this impact. We've been working with denominational leaders to help them tell the story. We've done group studies with the United Church of Canada and their outreach arm called EDGE. We've done studies with Fellowship Baptists and Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada to do targeted studies within their denomination so that they can tell the story within their own faith tradition of how this is impacting. And then, try to, one of the things we did as well was that the numbers that I mentioned around the tax benefits. We prepared a paper for Canadian Council of Christian Charities, and recently the Canadian Senate did a review of the value of charities, and faith communities are a big part of that. And they made a presentation at those Senate hearings. So I think gradually, as we begin to talk about not being an island in society, that that we truly are neighbors and participants, and that we rightly assume that role. I mean, there's been lots of challenges that the churches have been facing in recent years. Declining attendance and declining finances and all of that. But I think it's up to us to not fall into the trap of thinking that we need to retreat in exile in order to eventually thrive. I think we are thriving within society, and we need to claim that role.
I guess that brings me to, I mean, this is a small church podcast. Yeah. What do you find the impact of small churches is? And I think you've even taken a look at how that might even compare to some of the larger churches and their impacts.
Yeah. So one of the things that we did was to break down those dollar impacts. And I mentioned it's dropped down to about $4, and I think it's 22 cents or something like that. In larger churches, it tends to be $4.25. In smaller churches, it's about $4.10. So it's pretty close.
Yeah.
And when you think of the capacity that bigger churches have in terms of space to make available to community, larger churches tend to be in larger communities where there's a larger population base in order to serve and generate more impact. When you look at that comparison, small churches are doing really well with the resources that are available to them. One of the things that we find is that larger churches, well, it doesn't matter what kind of church you are, but you're always generating socioeconomic impact by your spending. And so if you're employing people, you're generating social impact. A lot of larger churches are they're not relying on it, but they produce a lot of socioeconomic impact because they have large staffs, and they're paying their staff, and those staff in turn take that money home and they spend it in their communities. Small churches rely really heavily on their volunteer base.
Yeah.
And their that relationship that those volunteers have with people in the community, in terms of a lot of small churches foster community festivals, so harvest festivals and Canada Day celebrations and Thanksgivings and hosting. They haven't got houses that are close together to go to for Halloween, and so they host Halloween events for kids in the community and things like that. So whereas larger churches and larger centers might be relying on programming and their capacity to spend in the community to create social impact, small communities are doing it, and small churches are doing it by establishing relationships through their volunteers and through the community programs and those activities like renting out their sanctuaries to community theater groups and those kinds of things.
Well, I found, in my own studies and working with small churches, that relationship is really what pushes forward and excites the small church. And I think you may have used the term individual impact as part of the socioeconomic type of thing. And certainly the small churches that I've run across, that's where they shine. They're in with, they know, they're talking with the people in the community, and they can have just an amazing impact. Can you give you're working with research right now right across Canada, and even with small churches. Do you have any anecdotal, I'll call it, as versus some quantitative research, but anecdotal thoughts on just some small churches that you've been talking to and working with?
Well, I think the big thing is that small churches, they recognize that, I was talking earlier about the church seeing itself as a neighbor.
Mhm.
Individuals in small churches and in small communities, the people in those communities are all their neighbors. Everybody knows everybody. And so when they're engaging in those community festivals and those sorts of things, it's their next door neighbor that
Yeah.
they're meeting with. And whereas in the city, you might live on a suburban street and you might not even know the person across the other side of the driveway, which is unfortunate, but
Mhm.
it's typical in city life. And so I think that the thing that we see most is just that whole dynamic of neighborliness, of relationship, and how that bears out in and the way that community meals happen in the faith settings. And so it's not a church event, it's a community event that takes place in the church,
Mhm.
which gives it a different dynamic.
Yeah. Now, church leaders, pastors, um, how can they begin to, well, impact outside their walls if perhaps they have become insular, they've been just keeping themselves running, and maybe this last 2 years has been one of those real times where some churches have become very much, oh man, we got to keep ourselves alive. Others have reached out even more, and I think that's a marvelous thing. But can you give some thoughts, some advice on that?
Yep. I think a really strong lesson comes from the way that many denominations have reimagined their role in international missions. So it used to be that, I grew up in the Baptist church, and it used to be that, I hear about missionaries in Sunday school who would gone off to Africa and India, and, to carry out these development projects and that sort of thing. But often the agenda was set here in Canada
Yeah.
or here in North America, and it was taken over somewhere else. And it was like, we've got something that we're going to share, and we're going to make it better over there. And not to say that didn't have huge impact and huge benefit, but we've over the years we've rethought that, and now most mission programs are defined by the people who live in those communities and who live in those countries, and we enable those people to identify what their needs are, and then we help them meet those needs. We help them provide resources for that. And I think we've forgotten to do that domestically.
Yeah.
I think that churches continue to look at their communities, and they say, this is what our community needs, without talking to the community. And I think that the biggest thing that we can do is to surrender our need to set that agenda, and simply go to the community and say, we want to be a good neighbor. We want to participate and contribute to the common good. Can you tell us what you think society needs? What does this community need? How can we help people who aren't a part of the church do what they think is best for this community? And in most cases, those motives and needs align, and we can find ways to help resource that. But I think as long as we continue to think that we have to tell society what it needs in its own particular communities, we're going to continue to have really significant disconnect.
Hmm. When I think of that, I think certainly there's a good news sense in which a Christian church enters a community. Um, and what I'm hearing you say is perhaps context. Is it good news if you can't explain it to the people in the community as to where they're living, how they're living, and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's true. We have lots of biblical examples of it. Jesus himself, he would teach a lot of principles, but when he engaged with an individual, he would often just say, "What do you need? How can I help you?
How can I help you?"
Yeah, and I think as far as our own churches and our own membership and our own lives go, we have our different faith traditions have different emphases around our different values, core values. But when it comes to the people outside the church, it simply comes down to saying, what do you need? How can I help you? How can I be your neighbor?
Mm-hmm. Well, I hate to say it, but we're running about to the end of our time here, and I've got a few more questions I jotted down here. Okay, I'll ask one last question,
Sure.
and that's maybe just because I've been taken on an interim pastoral position in the last number of months. I'm living with the whole pandemic, which has added a whole new value or lack of value to people and all that sort of stuff. How do you see reaching into a community at this point where there's been restrictions, where there's been all sorts of stuff which have turned us upside down as churches, and we're still trying to figure out who we are? I'm not sure I really have a question other than, what do you think? What are we doing right now?
Yeah, I think that coming out of this, I think people are looking for a place to connect or with people to connect and not quite knowing how to do that. I think churches have been also forced into the position of learning to have less reliance on our buildings.
Yeah.
To do that. We for a long time, faith has been rooted in our steeples and in our walls and with our stained glass windows and that sort of thing. And we recognize theologically, we recognize that the church is both place and people.
Right.
But I think that COVID has really forced us to swing that pendulum a bit back towards the church as people and using that sense of identity to re-engage with the wider community, so that we're not inviting them to come to our building. We're inviting them to be a part of our community, part of the group of people that we are, and to find some connectivity around that. And I think that's probably the most profound effect. There's all sorts of examples of how we can use technology better and connect by Zoom and all of those kinds of things that churches have been thrust or had thrust onto them during COVID. But I think the biggest thing is to recognize that our church buildings are resources, but they're not the church. And as long as we continue to think of the church as simply as a building, again, we're going to continue to feel disconnected from the wider community.
A very wise word. And I think that's what I'm finding in the pastoring that I'm doing right now is, it's the people, not the building. Yeah. Anyways, sorry, we're about done. But thank you very much, Mike. I've really appreciated this. And I just want to say once again, thank you for joining us on our podcast today.
My pleasure.